The air in the living room didn't just cool, it shattered into jagged pieces. My mother wiped her mouth with a festive napkin, looked directly across the table, and detonated the grenade she had been holding for 10 years. Your wife's kid has no right calling us grandma and grandpa, my mom said to my 14-year-old stepdaughter on Christmas. Right in front of everyone. My 8-year-old son stood up, walked over, and said something that made the room go silent. He had realized exactly what was happening before I even found my voice. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the vacuum before a shockwave. The cheap cinnamon candles flickered on the mantel, casting nervous shadows against the beige walls. Beside me, Sophie turned a shade of pale that made her look like a ghost. Her hands gripping the tablecloth until her knuckles turned white. My father kept his eyes glued to the television. Pretending the family wasn't disintegrating 3 feet away. Jen's hand found mine under the table. Her fingernails digging into my skin, anchoring me to the earth while the world tilted sideways. I couldn't breathe. Paralyzed by the sheer, naked cruelty of the moment. Carter sat on the floor. Surrounded by the wrapping paper of the $500 console my parents had bought him. He looked at the plastic controller, then at his grandmother's defiant face, and finally at his sister's trembling shoulders. He didn't scream, He simply dropped the controller. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, final thud that echoed louder than any shout. He walked over to Sophie, grabbed her cold hand, and stared down the adults with terrifying clarity. He was the only one in the room acting like a man. The radiator hissed, filling the gap where an apology should have been. Carter's voice was small but steady, lacking the confusion of childhood. If she is not your granddaughter, he said. Looking at my mother, then I am not your grandson. My mother gasped, a sharp intake of air like a tire puncturing. She looked to me for backup, expecting me to enforce the hierarchy she had built. Instead, I watched my son become the person I had failed to be. He had drawn the line I was too cowardly to draw. Come on, Carter whispered to Sophie, pulling her toward the hallway. We're going home. The movement broke my paralysis. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floorboards, and reached for our coats. My mother finally found her voice, shrill and desperate. Josh, don't be dramatic, she snapped, using the tone she used when I was a teenager. I'm just speaking the truth. I didn't look back at her. If I turned around, I knew I would say things that could never be unsaid. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was incinerated. The cold winter air hit us like a slap as we marched to the car. We buckled in without a word, the engine roaring to life in the dark suburban street. Carter held Sophie's hand in the back seat. His grip tight, while Jen wiped a silent tear from her cheek. I drove away from the house that had raised me, watching the Christmas lights blur in the rearview mirror. The car ride home was silent, but for the first time, it was a silence of decision. The silence in the car forced my mind backward, drifting to a sterile hospital room 10 years ago. I was 28 years old, smelling of burnt ozone and antiseptic. My hand wrapped in thick gauze after an industrial electrical panel exploded in my face. Jen was the nurse who changed my bandages without flinching at the charred skin. Her touch was gentle. H, a stark contrast to the voltage that had thrown me across the warehouse floor. H, we talked for hours that night about everything and nothing. I fell in love with her laugh before I even knew she had a daughter. H, 3 months later, I met Sophie at a sticky booth in a local diner. She was 4 years old, H, hiding behind a plastic menu that was twice the size of her head. She peered at me with wide, cautious eyes, H, assessing if I was another temporary character in her unstable life. I ordered pancakes with extra syrup, H, and she slowly lowered her guard. By the end of the meal, she had shared a sticky smile. It didn't take long for Miss Stetter,
H, Josh,
to become
Uncle Josh, and eventually just Dad.
My parents were different from the start. The H. When I first introduced them to Jen and Sophie, the air in their living room grew heavy and stiff. My mother offered tea in the good china, but didn't offer a single question to the little girl sitting on the sofa. H. Sophie swung her legs, trying to make herself small, sensing the invisible barrier in the room.
The H.
Dad talked about the weather and the Bucky's game, his eyes sliding right past the child, as if she were a piece of furniture. The H. It was polite, but it was freezing. I told myself they were traditional people who just needed time to adjust to a blended family. H. I made excuses for their silence, calling it generational awkwardness rather than active dislike. When Jen and I got married, H, my parents attended, but they stood stiffly in the back like court observers rather than family. In the photos, they are smiling, H, but their eyes are vacant. They never held Sophie's hand during the reception. They never asked to dance with her. I saw it happening, H, and I chose to look away. The cracks became undeniable during Sophie's 6th birthday party. The H, we hosted a small gathering in our backyard with cake and balloons. My parents showed up empty-handed, H, claiming they had forgotten the date, despite my 3 reminders. Yet, a week later, H, they drove 2 hours to my nephew's baseball game with a brand new mitt and a $50 bill. When I confronted my mother, H, she waved a hand dismissively. She said Jen's family probably handled the gifts, so they didn't want to overstep. It was a lie wrapped in etiquette. Over the years, Sophie stopped trying to be loud and started trying to be perfect. The H. She brought home straight-A report cards, hoping for a well done. That never came. She learned to bake my father's favorite cookies, H, presenting them on holidays only to have them placed on a side table and ignored. She became a shadow in their house, H, present but unaccounted for, while my brother's kids were treated like royalty. My parents weren't cruel with words back then, Esh. They were cruel with their absolute indifference. H. I spent a decade buying into the delusion that exposure would eventually create affection. I thought if I brought her around enough, if she was good enough, they would finally see her. I was wrong. Driving through the dark tonight, H. The truth settled in my gut like a heavy stone. Time doesn't heal a wound that you keep picking at. It just makes the scar tissue harder. I hadn't been keeping the peace all these years. I had been slowly teaching my daughter that her love was unrequited. It started quietly 8 years ago, when my father retired. The pension checks were smaller than the lifestyle, he refused to abandon, and he hinted at trouble over Sunday dinners. H. He mentioned the rising cost of utilities and the leak in the roof with a practiced, wary sigh. I wanted to be the good son who could carry them. So I set up an automatic transfer of $1,200 a month. H. It was supposed to be temporary help. Instead, it became a monthly subscription to their approval. The money didn't just keep the lights on, it fueled a delusional engine. My brother Kyle, 33 and chronically unemployed, treated my parents' home like a free hotel. Every few months, he had a new startup idea that required seed money. A revolutionary app, a drop shipping empire, a crypto scheme. My parents funneled my hard-earned cash directly into his pockets. They called it supporting his dreams. I called it throwing good money into a furnace. But I never stopped the transfers. The hypocrisy became a physical weight I carried in my chest. When Sophie needed a graphing calculator for advanced math, my mother sighed deeply. She claimed their fixed income was stretched too thin to help with such expensive school supplies. I accepted it and bought the calculator myself without complaint. 2 weeks later, my father bought Carter a brand new youth football helmet and professional cleats. He paid in cash, peeling crisp bills from a wallet that was thick with the money I had sent them. It wasn't just the favoritism. It was the blatant indulgence. They claimed they couldn't afford to fix their own car. Yet my mother came to Easter dinner with a designer handbag. They pleaded poverty when we suggested a family vacation. Yet they installed a new hot tub on their deck the following summer. I watched the water bubble and steam, knowing exactly whose labor had paid for the electricity. I was funding their comfort while they actively rationed their kindness toward my daughter. I sat down recently and did the math. Staring at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. $1,200 a month for 8 years. That totaled $115,200. That is a college education. That is a down payment on a house. That is a safety net for Sophie that I set on fire to keep my parents warm. I looked at the total sum and felt a wave of nausea. I had effectively financed their ability to reject her. For years, I told myself this was simply what dutiful sons did. I convinced myself that the money was a bridge, a way to keep the connection alive, until they finally came around. I thought if I made their lives easier, they would have the emotional bandwidth to love Sophie. It was a transaction I had invented in my head. I was paying a premium for a product that they had no intention of ever delivering. I was buying silence, not love. The realization hit me harder than the electrocution ever did. Every dollar I sent to Westerville was a dollar I took away from my own household. I had prioritized their mortgage over my daughter's future. I had prioritized Kyle's failed businesses over Sophie's college fund. I wasn't just a passive observer of their cruelty, I was their primary investor. I was paying for the roof over their heads. Never fully realizing they wouldn't let my daughter stand underneath it. It started in late October, when the leaves were turning orange and the air grew crisp. Sophie came home from school with a determination I hadn't seen before. She didn't want to buy a gift this year. She wanted to make one. H. She told us that handmade gifts were special because they cost time, not just money. She reasoned that if she put hours into something, my mother would have to appreciate it. It was flawed logic born of a desperate heart. She was trying to negotiate a treaty with yarn. H. We went to the craft store on a rainy Tuesday. Sophie stood in the aisle surrounded by skeins of wool. H. Her fingers brushing against the textures. She picked a deep H. Navy blue, because she remembered seeing my mother wear a coat that shade 3 years ago. It was a detail I had forgotten. But Sophie cataloged everything. She bought cheap bamboo needles and a beginner's guidebook. She didn't know how to knit, H, but she was willing to bleed to learn. It was a project fueled entirely by the hope of acceptance. H. The living room became her workshop for the next 8 weeks. Every evening after homework, the clicking of needles filled the silence. She watched YouTube tutorials on loop, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to master the purl stitch. I watched her restart the first 3 rows a dozen times. She would pull the yarn apart, frustration evident in the set of her jaw, H, and begin again. She wasn't just knitting a scarf. H, she was trying to weave herself into the fabric of a family that kept cutting her out. H. Watching her struggle was a specific kind of torture. I wanted to tell her to stop. H. I wanted to tell her that a scarf wouldn't fix 10 years of indifference. H. But how do you tell a 14-year-old that her effort is futile without breaking her heart yourself? So, H. I just brought her hot chocolate and complimented her progress. I became an accomplice to her heartbreak. I praised the uneven stitches, knowing they would eventually be inspected with a critical, unforgiving eye. I was cheering her on toward a cliff. One night in early December, she looked up from a tangle of blue wool. Her fingers were taped where the needles had rubbed the skin raw. "Do you think Grandma likes this blue?" she asked, her voice quiet. I wanted to be her favorite. The question hung in the air, H, heavy and suffocating. I nodded and lied, telling her it was perfect. I couldn't tell her that my mother hated handmade things. I couldn't tell her that to my parents. Effort without a price tag was just cheap clutter. She finished it 3 days before Christmas. It wasn't perfect. The edges curled slightly, and there was a noticeable knot where she had joined 2 skeins of yarn. But to me, H, it was a masterpiece of resilience. She held it up, beaming with a pride that made my chest ache. She folded it carefully, treating the acrylic blend like it was cashmere. She truly believed this was the key. She thought she had finally cracked the code to being loved. I smiled back, feeling like a traitor. Etch. She didn't have fancy wrapping paper, so she improvised. She found the comics section of an old newspaper and wrapped the scarf in tight, crisp folds. Atch. She tied it with a bright red ribbon she salvaged from her art supplies. "It looks artistic," she said, placing it gently by the door. H. She was ready to present her offering to the gods of our family. She walked into that holiday season unarmed. H. Holding nothing but a bundle of blue yarn, unaware she was walking straight into a firing squad. The living room was suffocatingly warm. H. Smelling of pine needles and stale ham. We gathered around the tree. The H. a ritual that felt more like a sentencing hearing than a celebration. The bias was impossible to miss. On the left, H. A mountain of shimmering red boxes towered over the carpet, each one tagged for Carter. On the right, tucked almost out of sight behind a chair leg, sat a single, flat package for Sophie. It wasn't subtle. It was a billboard declaring her status. My mother clapped her hands, urging Carter to start. He tore into the paper with 8-year-old ferocity, shredding the red foil. The H. When he revealed the sleek black box of the latest gaming console, my father beamed with pride. Only the best for our quarterback, Dad announced, patting Carter on the back. It was a $500 gadget for a child who already had an iPad. My mother's eyes shone with a warmth that never, not once, flickered in Sophie's direction. Then it was Sophie's turn. She picked up the flat box, her hands trembling slightly as she peeled back the tape. She moved slowly, preserving the paper, trying to show gratitude before she even saw the gift. Inside lay a thin, beige sweater that looked 2 sizes too small. As she lifted it, the price tag flipped over. A bright orange clearance sticker screamed $12. My mother hadn't even bothered to peel off the sticky evidence of her discount affection. Jen stiffened beside me, her breath hitching in her throat. I saw her jaw muscle jump, a physical restraint of the scream building inside her. We had agreed to keep the peace for the kids, but I could see that treaty was about to be shredded. Sophie, bless her heart, didn't flinch. She hugged the scratchy fabric to her chest and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Grandma, she said softly. It's lovely. It was a lie of pure grace. She was protecting them from their own tackiness. The absorbing the insult so the evening wouldn't shatter. Then came the moment I had been dreading. Sophie reached for her newspaper, wrapped bundle. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, and walked over to where my mother sat in her recliner. I made this for you, Sophie whispered, extending the package with both hands. I worked on it for 2 months. My mother looked at the newspaper like it was soiled trash. She took it with 2 fingers, her nose wrinkling slightly, as if she feared whatever was inside might be contagious. Mom tore the paper open without care, revealing the navy blue scarf. The uneven stitches and the knot were visible under the lamplight. Shouting that this was made by a child's hands. She stared at it for 3 seconds. She didn't put it around her neck. She didn't check the length. She simply set it down on the coffee table, pushing it aside to make room for her wine glass. That's nice. Dear, she said, her voice completely flat. Before Sophie could retreat, my mother turned her head toward the entryway. My brother Kyle, who had been hiding in the kitchen to avoid helping with dinner, had just walked back in empty, handed and grinning.
Kyle, honey!
Come sit by me, she cooed, her face lighting up with genuine joy. Sophie stood frozen, the rejected scarf lying like a dead animal between them. She took a brave, shaky breath and asked the question that would end the world. Grandma, aren't you going to try it on? I just wanted to see if it fit. The question hung in the warm air like a death sentence. My mother didn't look at the scarf. She looked through Sophie with a cold, sharpening gaze. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She turned her head slowly, her lips thinning into a hard, bitter line. Your wife's kid has no right calling us grandma and grandpa, she said. The words were heavy and final. She adjusted her designer glasses, staring directly at me. The impact was physical. Shh. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I had been kicked. Sophie didn't cry immediately. She just seemed to shrink, her spirit retreating into the marrow of her bones. Beside her, Carter stood up from his pile of expensive plastic toys. He didn't look like an 8-year-old anymore. He looked like a mirror reflecting our shared shame. He took Sophie's hand, his small fingers interlaced with hers. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. My father finally looked up from the television, but there was no rescue in his eyes. He just nodded once, confirming the cruel boundary my mother had just drawn in the sand. She's right, Josh. He muttered, his voice gravelly and indifferent. We've been polite for 10 years, but facts are facts. I felt a roar rising in my throat, a decade of suppressed resentment finally catching fire. I realized then that I had been paying for their loyalty with every monthly check. Jen was already moving. She grabbed our coats from the rack with a violent, efficient grace. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, her eyes fixed on the door. I didn't say a word to my parents. There was nothing left to negotiate with people who weaponized bloodlines against a child. I stood up, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. I reached for the navy blue scarf lying abandoned on the table. It felt like a lead weight in my hand. We walked out into the freezing night without looking back. The transition from the stifling house to the biting Ohio wind was a mercy. I buckled Carter into the back seat, while Jen held a trembling Sophie. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and holiday decorations that felt like a mockery. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the heater struggling against the cold. My hands gripped the steering wheel, so hard the leather groaned under my palms. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The house was unnervingly quiet. I opened my bank portal and stared at the scheduled transfer for January 1st. $1,200. I clicked the cancel button with a steady finger. The screen refreshed, confirming the deletion. The recurring drain on my life was over. It felt like cutting an umbilical cord that had been strangling my own family. I was done subsidizing their comfort. They wanted to be strangers, so I would treat them like ones. I went to the garage and found my industrial tool chest. I needed to work, to move, to scrub the feeling of failure off my skin. My phone began to buzz on the workbench. It was my brother Kyle, probably looking for his next handout. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 minutes later, a text arrived from my mother. She called me ungrateful and dramatic. She told me I owed her an apology for ruining the holiday dinner. I didn't reply to her text. Instead, I took a high-resolution photo of the blue scarf sitting on my workbench. The uneven stitches were beautiful in the harsh, fluorescent light. I posted the image to my social media page with a short, clinical caption. I detailed exactly what was said to a 14-year-old girl on Christmas night. I didn't use insults. I just used their own words as a mirror. I hit post and watched the notifications begin to climb. By noon, the extended family was in an uproar. My mother's church friends were asking questions she couldn't answer. The public shaming was a digital firestorm she hadn't anticipated. She tried to delete her own defensive posts. But the damage was irreversible. People saw the scarf and they saw the cruelty. My father called me 3 times, his voice frantic on the machine. He wasn't worried about Sophie. He was worried about the mortgage payment I had just deleted. The final blow came in the afternoon. A silver sedan pulled into my driveway, and a woman I hadn't seen in years stepped out. It was Aunt Margaret, my father's wealthy and estranged older sister. She walked up to my door with a thick envelope tucked under her arm. She didn't offer a hug, she offered a document. "I saw your post,"
Josh!
she said, her voice like iron. "I think it is time we redefined who belongs to this family." Margaret sat at our kitchen table, her presence commanding and sharp. She wore a tailored wool coat that smelled faintly of expensive cedar and ancient resolve. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or false sympathy. She simply slid the thick manila envelope across the scarred wood toward me. I opened it to find notarized papers, heavy with legal jargon and official seals. They were trust fund documents, established for both Sophie and Carter. Margaret watched my face, her eyes steady and unblinking. The numbers on the pages were staggering, far eclipsing any support I had ever provided. Margaret explained that she had watched my parents' behavior from a distance for years. She had seen their greed and their selective memory regarding bloodlines. She told me she had no intention of letting her estate fall into the hands of my brother Kyle. By establishing this trust, she was making a permanent declaration. She was claiming Sophie as her own kin. It was a massive, calculated strike. My phone vibrated violently against the tabletop, interrupting the gravity of the moment. It was my father, calling for the 10th time that morning. I finally answered, putting the device on speaker so Margaret could hear. His voice was shrill and panicked. Stripped of its usual patronizing calm, he didn't ask about the children or the holiday. He demanded to know why. The monthly bank transfer had been revoked. He claimed I was killing them by withholding their survival. I looked at Margaret, who offered a thin, shark-like smile. I told my father that the money was gone because he had chosen to be a stranger. I explained that strangers do not receive $1,200 a month for existing. He began to curse. His words a desperate scramble of guilt and entitlement. He threatened to sue me for elder abandonment. I hung up the phone while he was still screaming. The silence that followed was heavy and final. Margaret stood up, smoothing her skirt with a crisp, decisive snap. She asked to see the scarf Sophie had made. I led her to the garage where the blue yarn sat on the workbench. She picked it up, running her fingers over the uneven stitches with genuine care. She didn't look for flaws. She looked for the effort behind them. She draped it around her neck and looked at herself in the dusty mirror. "It is beautiful," she whispered softly. The She told me that she was leaving for Switzerland in 2 weeks. She wanted Sophie to write to her. H. To share her school progress and her dreams. H. Margaret was offering a lifeline that had nothing to do with my parents' narrow definitions. H. She was providing a legacy of respect rather than a debt of obligation. As she walked to her car, she turned back once. H. She told me that pride wouldn't feed my parents, but that was their problem now. The fallout intensified over the next few days. H. My parents were forced to list their house in Westerville because they couldn't meet the mortgage. Without my contribution, H. Their house of cards collapsed into the dirt. They sent me messages through cousins, pleading for a meeting to discuss a compromise. They tried to use my childhood memories as leverage, reminding me of all they had done. I blocked every single number. H. I was no longer interested in buying their affection. My brother Kyle tried to corner me at my workplace. He waited by my truck, looking disheveled and frantic. He told me that Mom was devastated and that I was destroying the family. H. I looked him in the eye and told him to get a job. I explained that his free ride was over because the driver had left the vehicle. H. He shouted something about blood being thicker than water. I drove away without responding. The old ties were officially severed. H. By the end of the month, my parents had moved into a small, 2-bedroom apartment. It was a place they would have mocked a year ago. H. They lost the hot tub, the car, and the status they valued so much. They were finally experiencing the exclusion they had practiced on Sophie for a decade. The irony was bitter and perfect. H. They were on the outside looking in, watching us be a family from afar. They had finally found their true level. H. We spent New Year's Eve at home, just the 4 of us. The house felt lighter, the shadows of my parents finally scrubbed away. Sophie was smiling again, her confidence returning in small, steady increments. She was already planning her next knitting project. H. This time a blanket for Margaret. I sat on the sofa, watching my children play a game on the new console. I realized I hadn't lost anything. I had simply stopped paying for people who didn't love us. A year has passed since the night the blue scarf became a shroud for my old life. The house feels different now. H. Scrubbed clean of the heavy, conditional air that used to drift in from Westerville. I sat at my workbench today, H. Cleaning the grease from my hands after a long shift at the plant. My back still ached, but it was a good pain. A. I no longer feel the phantom weight of those monthly transfers pulling at my wallet and my conscience. H. The blue scarf didn't stay in our garage for long. Sophie sent it to Aunt Margaret, who sent back a photo from the Swiss Alps. In the image, Margaret is smiling, the uneven navy stitches wrapped firmly around her neck against the wind. H. Sophie keeps that photo pinned to her mirror as a constant reminder. It is proof that her love was never the problem. The problem was the recipients. She finally stopped trying to earn a seat at a table that was never ours. H. My parents still try to reach out through third parties. They sent a letter last month through a cousin, H., claiming my mother was ill and needed financial help. I didn't open it. H. I simply wrote, refused, on the envelope and dropped it back in the mail. Jen watched me do it, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride I had never seen before we cut them off. We don't argue about holidays anymore. H. The stress of their expectations has evaporated into the cold Ohio air. Ch. Carter is 9 now, and still the fiercest protector of his sister. He tells his classmates that Sophie is his real sister because she helps him with math and shares her snacks. H. He doesn't understand the concept of half blood or step relatives. To him, family is the person who is standing right there when you fall. H. I look at him and realize the greatest gift I gave him wasn't a gaming console. H. It was the permission to walk away from people who are toxic. The savings account for Sophie's college fund is growing rapidly with that redirected $1,200 every month. H. The bank notification pops up on my phone, but it no longer feels like a ransom payment. H. It feels like an investment in a future where she will never have to beg for a scrap of recognition. She is planning to study nursing. H. Just like her mother. She wants to be the person who mends things that are broken. It is a beautiful, quiet irony. Tonight, H. The four of us sat in the living room while the snow began to fall outside. There was no television noise. H. Just the sound of a family that finally fits together. I looked at the spot where the blue yarn used to sit and realized my mistake. The H I had spent 10 years trying to fix my parents when I should have been protecting my children. The truth is finally clear. H. I didn't destroy my family last Christmas.